I'll say at the outset that I've never been particularly fond of Star Trek. This isn't to say I positively dislike it, and at its best it's an exploration of human ideas, characters and values that sometimes rises to the level of the cerebellum. Star Wars, without which Star Trek would have gone and died largely unnoticed a very long time ago, gave rise to a subgenre that reduces sci-fi to laser guns and spaceships, and Star Trek, again at its best, is a necessary corrective. But its best doesn't come around that often, and hasn't come around for decades. Even in its most fondly regarded series, The Next Generation and the original series, it achieved it only episodically. Like The X-Files, it seems to be remembered more for its exceptions than its rule. Too often that necessary corrective overcorrected, giving us a series that not only lacked the more flashy appeal of Star Wars and its descendants, but that sacrificed the human element in favour of lofty technocratic idealism that, paradoxically, had very little of worth to say about the societies and situations it found itself in. I've done undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in philosophy and ethics, and believe me, my lecturers wouldn't magically have become more interesting if placed on the bridge of a Federation starship, largely because the ideas they were describing are bullshit in any setting. But Trek too often swapped the Socratic for the solipsistic, philosophy for piety. Indeed, though Jean-Luc Picard is now held up as one of the series' most memorable fixtures, he wasn't much liked for a significant part of the Next Generation's first run, and it took the injection of the Borg, some threat, action and drama into the sententious, moralistic lecturing, to stop the fanbase absconding without leave. But we can argue the merits and demerits of old Trek another time. There is, by contrast, precious little argument at all about new Trek, in the form of Picard and Discovery in particular. It is, by seemingly common acclamation, lacking merit to begin with. And with Season 4 now underway on Paramount+, I thought it might be profitable to examine why that's so in the case of Discovery. What's changed? Where has it gone wrong? Why has it failed to achieve anything like the integrity and seriousness earlier iterations of Trek accomplished? Season 4 is a good place to start. Other and better and more seasoned critics than I have done yeoman's work dissecting its earlier offerings, and there's no point me rehashing content you'll have already seen from the likes of Nerdrotic and The Critical Drinker. But it's also ideal because the series seems to have doubled down on the flaws of earlier series, rather than drawing out their strengths, few in number though they are. There are two fundamental questions, the meta of philosophy, and the particular of technique, especially in writing and narrative structure. They tie together, which makes it difficult to keep them separate in any critique. To do so would be to miss the point, since the philosophy influences the writing, which in turn represents the philosophy. But I'll make the distinctions where I can, and otherwise explain, or try to, where and why the lines are blurred. Beginning with the meta, I think we should dispense at the outset with the idea that diversity is a problem by definition. Though modern filmmaking has an infuriating tendency to make every setting resemble an especially multicultural inner-city borough or district, no matter how small and isolated and rural, and so no matter how implausible that may be, diversity has always defined Star Trek. The original series famously had the first interracial kiss on screen, to say nothing of interspecies relations, at a time when that was truly daring. The crew of the Enterprise boasted women, Russians, Japanese, which was remarkable for its day. It stopped short of addressing homosexuality, at least in part, because the show's ratings had plummeted following that aforementioned interracial kiss, which NBC's affiliate shows in the South refused to broadcast. This, I think, is interesting in its own right, because Star Trek's diversity hasn't just become annoying with the introduction of Alex Kurtzman and the inauguration of New Trek. There's a sense in which Trek's diversity has always been irritating. And I mention this only because an analysis that simply points to diversity and says, ergo, misses a fundamental point of old Trek. It's always pushed these boundaries, and it has always irked people when doing so. But at the same time, any defense of Trek which points to its past activism as an excuse for its present activism is likewise deficient. Not all causes are of equal merit, and not all tactics are equivalently excusable. Original Trek pushed back against real and objectively bad social stigmas and tackled very real and objectively unjust discrimination. Whether that remains so today, in the age of affirmative action and social justice activism, is unclear. Original Trek spoke truth to power, whilst modern Trek can, I think convincingly, be argued to be speaking the truths of power, specifically those of a cultural elite whose claims of white supremacy and bigotry against trans and queer people are not as well evidenced, not as apparent, as the old claims against racism were, given we now live, as I've said, in an age of diversity and inclusion, of affirmative action, where supposedly oppressed minorities demonstrably enjoy greater support from the state and from elite opinion formers than the genuinely oppressed minorities of bygone eras did. Indeed, as educational attainment figures in the UK show, and as suicidality and unemployment and health statistics in general show, both in the UK and in the US, those who are chiefly disenfranchised and unsupported by modern political systems tend rather to be the white working classes. Yet not only do they not enjoy the same level of political affirmation by the progressive set in politics and the media, they are most often demonized by these same sets. The demonization of white men in general has been elevated to the level of meme, and not just by Discovery. But Discovery deserves a special scorn as much for what it doesn't say as for what it does. It doesn't even bother to criticize the social conservatism of the white working classes because they simply don't exist in its universe, where even the lowest ranking engineer or mechanic must have a double major in physics and social justice. This deprives the series of any chance at doing something that's even interestingly wrong, because it forgoes even a one-sided socio-philosophical debate, of the kind that older series did occasionally go in for, and instead treats these as settled issues. Its mission is not to convert, but to preach to those already converted, and again converted to causes that require more by way of argument than the clear injustices the original trilogy stood against. This is compounded by a move away from the original series' philosophy, the best philosophy in writing generally, of show, not tell. Even original Trek could lapse into lecture and take the didactic form, but in the diversity of its bridge crew it was showing a future in which our species had moved beyond 20th century political and ideological squabbles. It did not hector the audience by involving itself directly and affirmatively in current political debates, and where it lectured, it tended to abstract the topic of debate. The advantage of sci-fi is, after all, that you can invent alien societies and imbue them with recognizable features, critiquing them often on grounds of high morality and social philosophy, not merely repeating cant to camera. This is an imperfect difference, however, and not a clear divide. Some of what New Trek is criticized for today closely resembles what the original series was criticized for in the 1960s. But it's also true to say that the issues highlighted today are not as obviously unjust as those of the 1960s, and the way it treats with those issues too often brings Trek down into the muddy business of contemporary politics, rather than elevating contemporary politics to a more noble, intelligent, speculative, and philosophical level. And in doing so, it commits the very real crime that is lack of imagination. Given potentially limitless variations from which to form a premise, and practically limitless ways to elevate contemporary issues to the level of philosophy, it actually has nothing of any interest to say. It settles for received elite 21st century opinion, and repeats all the words and phrases that have been honed and crafted on Twitter by perpetually online activists. It's a hashtag show, but stretches what little wit there is in hashtag culture out over the space of hours. Like homeopathic medicine, diluting something that's small enough to begin with in a vat of amorphous goo produces something with a higher concentration of feces than it has trace elements of medicine. A series that set out to explore brave new worlds fails now, even to capture the complexity of our one current world. It has managed to make a universe full of alien cultures resemble the PR pseudo-morality of the San Francisco corporate boardroom. That's the meta-quandary and the meta-failing. Again, there is something of the inevitable about it. Given the history of Trek's social activism, if any series was ripe for this kind of treatment, it was Star Trek. And I don't think we can completely get away from the suggestion that this failure is not entirely of the series itself, but rather reflects a deeper preceding fault in the decline of modern progressivism. But there are failures that are entirely the show's own making, faults of writing, faults in technique, which is to say that the things it objectively does wrong are much clearer when we analyse how the above is incorporated into the narrative of Star Trek Discovery, how the writers treat with these issues, how they weave them, or rather smash them with a sledgehammer, into the story, how indeed the story and its politics are or are not balanced. And here Season 4 doubles down on everything that was wrong with Seasons 1, 2 and 3. Many of these are already well known: the absence of proper character, the messing about with the law, the attempt, again a hallmark of modern progressivism, to show perfection and moral purity rather than complexity and moral dilemma. Original Trek was psychologically astute. It was born in a period where Freud, for instance, was better read and better understood, where psychology was more interesting than you want to F your mum. Kirk, Spock, and Bones actually conform to the Freudian analysis of the human condition. Kirk as id, Spock as ego, Bones as superego. By instantiating these concepts in a triptych, it allowed for a fuller, more interesting exploration of what makes humans human, thereby ensuring that events in the plot were almost always more than mere contrivance, more than an excuse for action to happen, more than a reason to introduce threat and peril. Original Trek explored our nuanced and conflicting responses to these things, demonstrating overall a need for balance between the rational and the irrational, between emotion and logic, by showing the flaws that result from too much of either. It also ensured that there was enough time between action set pieces to allow these things to be more or less properly explored. Modern Trek has abandoned this approach entirely. There is, as mentioned, seldom any serious moral debate at all, and in Michael Burnham its ambition has been to present a character who already has the perfect balance of all three elements. Where there is a character conflict, it is usually because other characters have the faults and Michael Burnham has the answers, which the other more powerful, more privileged characters are too often reluctant to hear. Again, this is a reflection of the modern, progressive mindset, which tends to assume its own rightness and passes all disagreement as a failure to understand or to listen to it. One's opponents are flawed, the system is flawed, and it is to be opposed because the mere act of questioning frustrates progress. Because it has nothing very interesting to say, and because its philosophy does not like or stand interrogation, the writing has of late afforded less and less time for the audience to actually question the rightness of its hero and her actions. It's another example of Discovery aping a broader trend in filmmaking. When you have nothing to say, just make things loud and flashy so you don't have to expend time saying nothing. But this has seriously bad dramatic and artistic effects which stand quite apart from its broader philosophical deficiencies. Incompetent writing has no understanding of nuance, of pacing, and doesn't realize that drama, like everything in the universe, suffers from entropy, diminishing returns. If you demand 100% of the audience's emotion for one plotline, the riff on the Kobayashi Maru in episode 1 of season 4, for example, you cannot demand the equivalent for the cliffhanger ending to the parallel plotline, the destruction of Kwejian. Either one of these presents an episode's worth of drama, in the former case more than an episode, since it's overwrought, too quick, too dramatic, the stakes too high and for too long. But cramming both into the same episode necessarily detracts from one or the other, in this case the one that actually has lasting cosmic significance, and that forms the setup for the rest of the series. Competent writing would not have seen these two things squashed together. In keeping with the format of older iterations of Star Trek, the destruction of Kwejian would have been preluded by a much slower and more exploratory discursive build-up. You build the tension slowly, through investigation of an anomaly the first effects of which are subtle. It's like unraveling a conspiracy. It requires thought, meditation. Things are revealed piecemeal, culminating then in the dramatic revelation of the anomaly, the next great threat to the universe. Instead, the anomaly is revealed from the second act, and its consequences for Deep Space Beta, which is a name nobody should be proud to have created, involve the bulk of the cast in a life-or-death against-the-clock race from the first minute to the last. And because it's high-octane, there is no time to rest or to consider or to wind down before the cutaway to what was, throughout episode 1, barely even a subplot, the destruction of Kwejian. This is a problem endemic to modern film and television. By substituting setup for non-stop action sequences, it deprives the subsequent events of their own significance. There are only so many explosions you can watch before you become desensitized to them. Things can only go so fast for so long before the audience adjusts to it, usually by switching off. There is nothing, then, to switch them on again for the conclusion. It's just another big explosion, yet another thing we've scant relation to that goes wrong, and so no real emotional weight invested in its destruction. This lack of contrast is expressed in other ways. Dialogue, for instance, and it links back to the analysis of the series' meta. A recurring theme across all 4 seasons of Discovery is the use of babble as a kind of techno-spiritualist incantation. There is an overabundance of action, an overabundance of threat, an overabundance of existential decisions being thrust at the characters, but the trope, lazily deployed, is that science conquers all. The Kobayashi Maru is, or was anyway in its first iteration, a genuinely interesting variant of the trolley problem. Its design is that of the unwinnable choice, a lesson in mitigating loss. But in Discovery, like all previous dire situations, it can be overcome by frantically babbled science speak. We see precisely one person die, and an ancillary character at that, who we already knew was going to die. A, because he was ancillary, but had a name. B, because we were treated to 30 seconds of expository backstory, which more or less guarantees he's for the chop. It's a blatant trope in modern writing, an attempt to shoehorn in some kind of emotional weight that gives meaning to a subsequent death. But it's so formulaic that it actually telegraphs its intent, and so achieves the opposite effect to that it intended. When the station commander dies, the reaction is not, "Oh no, what a shame. He wanted to go home, that's so sad." It's, "Well, I saw that coming." I think we're also told that a couple of others died and there were a few injuries, but it's all perfunctory, that's a throwaway line. And so when the writers attempt to make it the basis for an aborted debate over the philosophies of leadership, it has no weight at all. Michael Burnham was right in the moment, just as she's been right in every other moment, whilst her opponent, the Federation president, is frustrating her with hypothetical questions, with caution. Caution being a check on progress, and checks on progress being, ipso facto, wrong. There were no real consequences to Burnham's decision because they techno-babbled their way out of the umpteenth existential dilemma they were faced with. Again, this is a constant theme of this series. Again, it's an example of terrible pacing, action as a substitute for development. The universe will be lost unless you can invent and discover time travel in the next 5 minutes. No problem. Babble, babble, quantum matrix defibrillomatical flange conducer does this, and if we combine it with the splat warp crystals we picked up on that mission to Klagazod 4 and energize it with the Zoggurat cabbage field, this might just work. And lo and behold, it invariably does. Most science fiction goes in for a certain amount of this, but rarely to anything like the same extent as Discovery. The effect is the opposite of that intended. The message is supposed to be the wonder and supremacy of science, human ingenuity and knowledge applied to the empirical method, a celebration of science as the solution to humanity's problems. But Discovery does something else. It elevates the impression of science to the status of the divine. There is no actual science being done or discussed, just a language game designed to capture the authority of science itself. And deployed in this way, science ceases to be a process, ceases to be human, loses all the constraints that make science worthwhile in the first place, but becomes instead a theological or magical chant. Science in Discovery is quite literally Deus Ex Machina. There is no situation these people cannot babble themselves out of. This is convenient for the writers because it means they can pay as little attention as possible to plausibility, to believability, to logic, to careful narrative and scene construction, and instead get back to what they really want to do, making pretty explosions on a green screen and exploiting strife for more than strife can possibly be worth. So it is that within the first episode of Season 4, we have the reintroduction of the Federation in something like a recognizable form, the introduction of important new characters with important and adversarial relationships with the main cast, the Federation president as mentor cum antagonist, I suppose, to Michael Burnham, and with implied darkness and complexity that's given no time at all to make itself apparent. Begging questions we have no time to ask. Approximately 5 seconds of consequential world building with the creation of the Archer space dock and the new Voyager, and its new warp drive equivalent is mentioned, the crew involved in repeated life or death scenarios from as early as the writers thought they could get away with, about 10 seconds of philosophical disagreement between Burnham and the President that were immediately pulled away from by the destruction of a planet that's supposed to be significant, though it has no actual relationship with the main plot, and is given practically no time on screen. And then the introduction of the next great threat to the universe, another kind of magic peril that it just seems like a contrivance at this point, an excuse for the rest of the plot to happen. This has knock-on effects on character, or rather the lack of character, and the lack of meaningful character development. Discovery has had 3 and a bit seasons now, with a main cast that's been largely intact throughout, but has only succeeded in creating 2-dimensional pastiches. The South Park hits have considerably more depth, and they're literally made of construction paper. Michael Burnham is temperamentally the same by episode 1 of Season 4, as she was in episode 1 of Season 1. She's learned precious few lessons because she's by and large been right from the outset. Tilly, despite having gone through, in Season 2's alternate universe timeline, experiences that ought to have had profound psychological effects, is still the same bubbly, naive, giggly, back-of-the-class schoolgirl as she was in Season 1. Gay scientist and gay doctor likewise went through what should have been character-changing, character-defining arcs in Season 2, yet between them have less personality and character development than the medical hologram on the Voyager. They've also exhausted what currency might have been found in their gayness now being quite milquetoast in contemporary 21st century society and shorn of the excitement it once possessed. This might be construed as a sign of progress. In my own writing, I've deliberately normalized gay characters, including main characters, as much as is possible to make them fit in with the modern reality, or at least the reality of the world in which they live. Being gay today is just not as dramatic and is not as risky in the 21st century as it used to be, and it's wrong to pretend otherwise. This is how you avoid making gay people political props. But careful writing can also tease out the lingering and unalterable differentness that is being gay. It's one thing not to play it up, but it's another thing to make it utterly irrelevant to the characters in question, and another thing again to drop the issue entirely. But Discovery got bored of that before Season 1 was finished, I suspect after they'd exhausted all Brian Fuller's material, and is much more interested in the current 21st century fad that is transgenderism. This is undeniably ripe as a concept. There's plenty that could and should be done with it from a narrative point of view. And in Adira and Grey, the series at least sets up the characters in a way that's not conventional. To the extent there is character development, it's largely found in these two. But it suffers from the tedium that comes with clearing the lowest of bars. Despite the potential of the premise, neither of the characters is actually interesting. Adira is another boilerplate, quirky misfit. Most characters in this series are just space autists of one flavour or another, whilst Grey is unfortunately as superficial as most publicly queer Gen Xers are today. It would be utterly tedious to find ourselves talking about pronouns 10 years from now, never mind several centuries hence. All this taken together sums up the fundamental point of Discovery, which is that it's pointless. It has nothing to say, and it says nothing very earnestly. It's facile and it's irritating, and not very interested either in this world or in its own. It tells a very small set of 21st century wokists what they want to hear, which is what they see every day on Twitter. And that's just painfully dull. It's faux radicalism. It's a mirror for its audience, which is painfully small. But it doesn't tell its audience anything new, anything interesting. It doesn't challenge them. It doesn't make them think. It boldly goes where everyone's gone before. And given the past of Star Trek and given the potential for Star Trek, that seems to me a great shame.